It's my great pleasure to introduce Ryan Rzepecki. Ryan is the founder and CEO of Sobi Social Bicycles, and we're really excited and appreciative that Sobi is a platinum sponsor of the NABSA conference this year. Ryan?
So I've really been looking forward to this opportunity to address all of you guys. The folks in this room have built this industry and changed cities all across North America. It actually all started here in Montreal, actually with the first launch in 2009, so I think it's very appropriate that we're back here at a time of rapid change in the industry. I've known some of you guys almost 10 years, and I can remember back to when we started in the industry that it would take literally a 15-minute conversation to explain to somebody what the heck bike share was and what we're trying to do. Fortunately, a lot has changed in the last few years, and in the last year particularly, where we have this unprecedented growth. As we prepare for the future, I think it's great to reflect on the path, the path we've taken to get here, and NABSA as an organization, what led to it being created and us being here today. NABSA was actually founded in 2014 in a time of crisis. PBSC and Alta were working toward bankruptcy. There's disputes between suppliers and operators and cities, and it was a very difficult time when the viability of our industry was being openly questioned in the press, and it was a very stressful time. Bill Dossett and a few others came together to create the NABSA that we now have leading us as an industry in an effort to bring together cities, equipment suppliers, and the operators to work toward our common goals that we share. I think that founding moment is still part of the DNA of this organization. And that's a good thing, because in 2017, we now face another existential crisis. Bikeshare went from extremely undercapitalized to probably the hottest investment category for venture capital over the last year. And then now there's been $2 billion invested into dozens of new companies, many of which are in the room here today. And we're now facing tremendous change, and there's only more on the horizon. I think, given this, it's really important to take this moment and think about our goals as individuals, as companies, and as this industry body. My personal goal is to promote the bicycle as a primary form of urban transportation. And I think many of the people in this room share that goal based on some of the things I've heard over the last few days. I think we can work together to really increase mode share. And my idea is, how do we take bike mode share from 1 to 5% in cities to 30, 40, 50% of cities? How do we make each of our cities look more like Copenhagen and Amsterdam than the car-centric places they are today? And if we frame it that way, we're actually all failing. And I know that may be hard to hear, because it's apparent from the rapid fire session yesterday that there's a lot of pride in what we've achieved, and we have achieved a lot in building this industry. But the fact is that most of our systems are undersized, underutilized, and serving a fairly narrow segment of the population, particularly affluent white people. And it's an indicative and very sad that bike share and the bicycle in general has come to be seen as a symbol of gentrification rather than a symbol of empowerment and freedom. And that's largely because of the neighborhoods that we serve and the people that are riding our bikes. We can and must do more. We have all the pieces around us right now to make this happen. And it's going to push some people outside their comfort zones over the next few years to do this. But I think it's really important that we embrace this change and all work toward our broader goals. And for me, there's 3 real key trends that are going to move us in this direction. The first is a move toward smart bikes and away from dock bikes. The second is a move slowly from toward permits from RFPs and monopolies. And last is a move toward pedal elects and away from regular pedal bikes. I'll spend some time on each, but I want to start by reminding everybody that we're in an industry that is only about 10 years old. Allison gave a good recap in an earlier presentation. I really benchmark it to Paris, which was the first time there's a large-scale system in a city and bike share was shown as a mode of transportation and not sort of like a marketing novelty. I was finishing an urban planning degree in 2008, soon after Velib had launched, and I saw the concept and I loved it, and I had the idea that if you take the technology out of the station and put it onto the bike itself, you have something that's way more cost-effective, way more user-friendly, and you can have a GPS on the bike and an integrated lock and an app to unlock it, which now many people are coming up with that idea, but but it was apparent even then that was going to be the future. So we incorporated in 2010 and had our first proof of concept later that year. This handy graph, I think, gives a good chart of the way the industry shaped. This was put together by NACTO. Many of you have probably seen this. In 2010, there was just a handful of dock-based systems. And when I started to talk to people, including many people in this room, about the idea of a dockless system, they were very, very uncomfortable. And I got a lot of questions like, well, aren't the bikes just going to be everywhere? And aren't they going to all end up stolen? And what about people without smartphones? Which are echoing a lot of the things that we're hearing today. But despite these many objections, we moved forward and began commercializing the technology in 2012 and 2013. And we started responding to RFPs that were written for dock-based systems. Literally, it would say, bike share system must have this kiosk and this many docking points and this type of infrastructure. But we found a few early adopter cities to give it a chance and to test out this new model. And then we slowly actually began to change the way RFPs were written and got cities to actually open up to a different technology approach. And you can actually see the last couple years, the blue, which is smart bike systems, have been growing more rapidly than the green, which is the dock-based model. And a lot of that growth, or the majority of that growth, was ours. And again, this is all before the last year and what's happened quite recently. In order to do this, we actually adapted our technology to the market quite a bit. We created geofences around the map to control where the bikes are going to go. And so if a user locked inside a geofence, they didn't pay any extra fees. If they locked outside of a geofence, they pay a small extra charge. Then the next user to take that bike and bring it back to a station would get a credit. It's also important to note that our bikes actually lock to something. So you can see it's secured to the rack. Which is different than the free-floating systems you're seeing now. So that means we have real accountability, and you can't just say, well, I put it where it was and somebody must have picked it up, because you actually know where the bike was secured. What's been really interesting, is how our different markets have taken this technology and tried different things out. Some of our programs have been really free range and encouraging people to lock everywhere. Others have been more restrictive and had high fees for locking outside of a station. I think it's actually really interesting for what Portland's been experimenting with lately, where they created these large free-range zones, and they actually expanded the program using existing bike corrals, and so they're actually able to serve a bigger part of the city without buying any new infrastructure. So I think we were successful in adapting to the market, in some ways maybe a little too successful, because I've actually heard people recently tell me that they went to Portland and they didn't even know this was a dockless system. So I guess that's a win, if not a strange one. So by the end of last year, we established a pretty nice footprint of major places around the U.S. The Portland project, we're in the Phoenix, Tampa, Atlanta, Orlando metro areas, Hamilton, Ontario. We even made our market entry into the European market. Now we're actually at over 12,000 bikes deployed. That's more than 40 projects in 25 cities and 6 countries. We're actually now approaching 450,000 users, and we've logged 3.8 million trips. So we've had a ton of growth to get to this point. But then China happened. Whereas before we were one of the largest players in the industry by a pretty big margin, now the whole numbers and scale of the industry are changing quite a bit. So last spring, Mobike launched the first 1,000 bikes in Shanghai. It had the integrated smart lock above the rear wheel, and it was freestanding rather than something that locked to a rack. I saw it actually just a few weeks after launch. I was in Shanghai for a conference, and I saw the unconventional design and noted it as something to watch. But fast forward 1 year, and both Mobike and Ofo have raised $1 billion, and each have deployed over 5 million bikes. Each. 5 million bikes. So when you think about the scale of our industry and what we've all tried to build for 10 years and what was able to accomplish in just 9 months, it blows the mind. And they're able to scale this quickly because they have massive problems with transportation and air quality in China, and the government there, rather than ban these new services, they're like, all right, mo bikes, mo better. Let's just like blow it out. And they didn't put any restrictions on, and they in fact actually used some government resources in terms of collecting bikes and warehousing bikes and things like that. So it actually took off, and part of it is too because of this overall smart bike model. And so the reason why I say, maybe some people in this room think it's very self-serving to say that smart bikes is the way forward versus dock bikes, but there's real things behind it. One is the lower capital cost, which everybody is aware of, and we're talking about an order of magnitude lower capital cost. And we even talk about what's come to market in the last year being significantly cheaper than our price point was a year ago. It's a better user experience when you can go from point to point. There's just so much consumer friction when you're having to worry about, is there a station near where I'm gonna go, and is that station gonna be available? I've had multiple times using bike share in other cities where I had to backtrack almost all the way home to find an empty dock. And imagine a bus system that only showed up once every 3 days. You would just never use it. You need to have that type of reliability. Next is the GPS data. That's useful for improving operations. It's incredibly useful for cities and making informed infrastructure decisions. And it's also, as you're thinking about brand engagement and sponsorship and advertising, it's really great to be able to measure and have that type of detail in the data. The next one's quite interesting, where before your station infrastructure had to match the bike. They were paired one for one. With a smart bike system or systems, you can actually have multiple players in the same market all sharing the same public right-of-way because the bike doesn't have to park in a specialty dock. So it is actually smart bike technology that enables the idea of multiple players in one market, which I'll dig into a little bit more later. And lastly, it's all of this together that's actually unlocked the amount of private investment. I know I've been trying to raise money in this space for a very long time, since 2008, 2009, 2010, and the idea that I'm going in and pitching a business that's selling bikes to government, believe it or not, investors didn't like to hear that model. It was slow moving and a very, very hard sale. Now what we have, if we can work together as an industry to create a new framework, is something that is more scalable and can attract venture capital, and that's why there's been money, and that's why all of a sudden a switch has been turned, because of the new models that are emerging. And it's happened. So you see billions of dollars coming into the space just in the last 9 months. This is plotting the 3 larger players in China, which is really the 2 larger players in China, each of which have crossed $1 billion. And then there's dozens of smaller players that have also raised significant amounts of capital. And Diana posed the question, where is this coming from? Well, for the Chinese ones, it's coming from Alibaba and Tencent. It's coming from the internet giants in China that are now treating bike share like an internet business. And the money behind it isn't fleeting. There's vast amounts of capital behind that capital. And so it's something that is going to be a sustaining trend. And look, things have not been perfect. This image in particular has been circulated quite widely. Not the one on the right, that's me. But the one on the left has been circulated quite widely, where you just see these piles and piles of bikes. I know that photo has scared the crap out of a lot of people in this room. This can't happen in our cities, and that's true, and it won't. We're going to adapt the model to make it work here. But it's indicative of, one, the oversupply that came without any regulation. And if you actually see in China now, they're moving toward some regulations and some sort of controls. And 2, it has a kind of a disposable mentality of the bikes. And I made a quip earlier today about the 9-year lifespan. There is value in creating a high-quality product and thinking about life cycle costs for sure. And I just think what they're doing is approaching the problem a little bit differently and understanding the replacement cycle. And sometimes, the cycle of innovation is driving things faster than worrying about designing for a 10-year asset. So it's an approach to product. And there's definitely some things that they have to do to be able to adapt to this market. I'm a pretty tall guy, but that would be, for most of us, a child-sized bicycle. But that is all changing, and that's the rapid cycles of innovation, and every 3 or 6 months there's a new product coming out. So as a result of all this, many cities have started to change their approach. San Francisco, probably much to Heath's chagrin, was the first to pass a permitting framework and regulation because of Blue Go-Go trying to enter that market, and it forced this policy question that we never really thought about is, what happens if someone just tries to launch one of these? We obviously had the technology to do that for several years, but just did not enter the market in that way. So as a result, there was a policy framework created in San Francisco, and then of course those that you heard Kyle speak, they were the first to implement and to start to see the results from that. And actually, the early results are looking pretty good. If you talk about total bikes deployed and total amount of bikes being used, the early results are looking really, really good. So as a result, I'm sure Kyle's getting tons of phone calls. We're talking to tons of cities. I think everybody in the space is trying to understand what the hell is this, and how do we prevent the bike piles but still allow for more bike riding. And so the broader trend, I think, is, can we move toward a permitting framework? Can you capture everything in a permit framework that does those controls? Or if it's a contract, is it a multiplayer contract? So I think, RFPs, I think, has been a topic discussed at this conference a lot, and the process as being one that's slow, and both on the private sector side and the public sector side, it's a painful thing. If it could be captured by a permitting framework, that could be great. And if not, maybe our contracts become a little bit more flexible and we think about multiple players in the market. Because that's the big thing, is going from one player where you just win a city and you're either in that city or you're not, to multiple people, multiple companies competing for consumer choice. And that's with tons of benefits for the end user. They've been introducing new low trip pricing, per trip pricing that has been widely adopted. It's a faster path to scaling a city, as we started to see in Seattle. They went from under 500 bikes, around 500 bikes, to several thousand smart bikes in just a few months, which have collectively created a network effect. And Seattle's not stuck waiting for the next CMAQ grant to come down the pipe. They actually just have the private sector investment going into it. And as a result of more of the city being covered, you actually are now seeing a more diverse group of riders, which I think is really important because we have a better shot of hitting our actual equity goals. And finally, because Seattle and other places are being proactive about permitting, you're able to ask for quality and service standards, control the process, and most importantly, get access to the data. So I think a lot of people that work for the public sector are thinking, hey, we saw what happened with Uber and Lyft, and we don't want to have that happen again. So it's time for folks in this room to have these conversations and think proactively about it, one way or the other, and have a stance on it one way or the other, because it is definitely happening. And so I know many of you are actually thinking, well, before I barely hoped to support one bike share system, so how the hell am I now going to support 3, right? Or is this all just a venture capital fad, and once the money dries up, what if I'm left without any bike share? That's another common concern. And many are probably indignant, thinking, we'll never have this on our city because we have to control our streets, and we just can't have piles of bikes. And these are all very valid concerns, and particularly in some of the mid-sized cities and smaller cities where you may not ever have the demand to support multiple bike share operators. But the trend line is very clear, and we don't know necessarily what's happening now. But we know where things are going to be heading. And if you don't believe me, just ask these 2 questions. One, how do you tell large sections of your city that they can't have a bike share system when there are several vendors that really are willing and able and want to come in? Even if you personally don't care about equity, it's just not a politically viable position to hold. And secondly, you may be able to keep out the foreign companies and some of these new upstarts, but what happens when a local bike rental company that's been in business for 30 years and say, I'm being impacted by bike share and I want to have a chance to compete? What happens when they start automating and introducing smart bikes into their fleet? Again, stamping out a small local business owner is going to be a politically difficult position to hold. So that means despite all this risk that the change presents, it is inevitable. This is something that we're facing, we're going to have to deal with, we're going to have these uncomfortable conversations, and we have to accept that there may be different rules for this industry for the next 10 years. And the focus should be on managing to get the good outcomes, managing toward our shared goals, rather than just trying to shut the door. And for me, this is an exciting and validating time and change. And I don't know necessarily what's going to project forward, but I believe that the industry is going to be in a better place because ultimately, consumer choice is going to improve the quality over time. It's going to improve the service levels over time. And I know that in the next couple of years, as Justin said, it may not be the same players at the table, but whoever is left standing are going to be delivering a much better quality product and service to the end users. Which leads to the last point, I believe, which is the inevitability of electric assist. Like most people in this room, on the product side or vendor side, we've been thinking about and working on electric bikes for several years. Unlike most of the people in this room, I've actually had a chance to ride a stationless electric bike in San Francisco for the last couple months as we've been doing field testing and internal testing. And I can say very securely that this is the future of the industry. This is a transformative technology, not just a minor evolution. It's not just a bike with a motor. It is a new class of vehicle. And it invokes a very powerful response in the users that have tried it. What our product does is sense how hard you're pedaling and provides a gradual level of assist that feels very natural and comfortable and approachable. It makes you feel superhuman. And it has this powerful psychological effect that has people coming back to it. We've been joking a lot that we didn't just create a new product here, we've actually created a drug. It is that powerful of an effect on the mind. And so electric bikes have this power to dramatically increase the size of the market that we're serving and the number of people that are willing to use a bike as a mode of transportation. If we're trying to go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% to the mass adoption that we all talk about, this is one of the keys to unlocking that. If you just have conversations with your friends that are not in the industry, talk to them about a regular bike versus electric bike, just watch what their reaction is and their sense of it is. It's because the technology takes away the pain of hills. It extends the range of trips, which in US City is very important, where you have maybe 3, 4, 5, up to 10-mile type of commutes versus going 1 or 2 kilometers to and from a train station. It appeals to a much broader demographic, including older people and people that may be out of shape, which in this country is something that we have to worry about and address. And it's also cooler. It just, again, appeal to a wider demographic that would never be seen riding a regular bike, but think it's actually cool to hop on an electric bike. And finally, it puts the bike share industry in with the emerging ecosystem of electric vehicles, both personal and shared electric vehicles, and soon fleets of shared electric automated vehicles. So this connection is going to take this short-term funding trend that we've all seen and wondering if it's just a fad and extend it out for several decades because we're just starting to see this transition. And the broader transportation category, you're seeing billions and billions of dollars being invested by very, very large companies that are betting that the future of mobility in cities looks a lot different than it is today. And I believe it is shared electric bikes paired with shared electric automated fleet vehicles. And from both a public policy perspective and a private market perspective and on the operations perspective, the folks in this room are on the front lines of this massive change that's going to affect all our cities, which is incredibly exciting. Many public sector folks here work for the agencies that will regulate self-driving cars. They're going to monitor that public space. They're going to be responsible for reallocating space away from private cars into shared modes, bicycles, and pedestrian projects. And on the private sector side, the first wave of investment was into ride-hail and the fundamental sensing and software for self-driving fleets. But in the next few years, bike shares are riding that second wave as it becomes obvious that bikes are an essential part of these automated fleets and mobility going forward. An electric bike, a shared electric bike, is compact and takes up less public space. You can deploy more than 100 of them for the price of one automated vehicle. And riding a bike actually is going to get safer and safer as there's less human beings causing crashes on the street. So these are actually synergistic technologies. So I saw this slide at a mini conference at our office in New York a few weeks ago. It's probably a little hard to make out, but in 1900 on the left, it says, where's the first car? There's a bunch of horse and carriages and one car. And the slide on the right, 1913, it says, where's the last horse? And it's a bunch of cars and one lonely horse. That is the type of change that we're experiencing now. We're talking about a decade. Over the next decade, a fundamental reorganization and reimagining of our cities. And everybody here is not just going to witness this. We get to actively participate in creating this amazing future. And that brings us back to where we began. How do we get bike mode share from being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% in cities to 30, 40, or 50%? And if you've ever been to a city like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, it's a little messy. When you have that many bikes out there, there's bikes everywhere. And yet people adapt, and as it becomes a preferred mode and not a fringe activity, they accept it as part of their daily life to have these bikes out there in the public right away. And in Copenhagen, it didn't happen overnight, actually. It took several decades of promotion and infrastructure development for that to actually look like this. What we actually have the opportunity in the West to do in the North American market is to rapidly accelerate that type of change and have a similar transformation in less than a decade. And that requires the public sector to be very creative with the way it reallocates space and regulates this new market. It requires the private sector to invest wisely and work with cities to protect the public interest and prevent the tragedy of the commons. For me, I'm excited to be a part of this future, and I look forward to working with all of you for the next 10 years to reshape the future of American cities.